Hi, friends. Thanks for joining me. By the time you see this, I think most of you have probably already been out and hopefully had a successful and exciting hunting season. Judging by the social media you send us, many of you have full freezers and happy hearts. And on behalf of everybody here at the Journal, I want to congratulate each and every one of you that went out and tried. In my book, at least, that makes you an honest participant in the food chain, and I believe that's the most important part. And speaking of honest, I did get an email this fall that led me to do some soul searching. In part, it said, Kyle, we realize you show us the hits and the misses, but how come all them other guys don't ever bother to show the fact that they don't always go out and get a great big buck everywhere they go? Well, the truth is, if you're a deer hunter, you know that ain't true. I do think, though, that many times we miss. Every once in a while I get a hit, but the truth is, most of the time, it doesn't even get that far. Most of the time, something goes wrong at the last minute, and that's what today's program is about. So, in the interest of reality and television, hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're going to take a look at just a few of the critters I didn't get right now.
I was just thinking about getting ready to leave when I looked down, and there was a giant buck. A huge buck was standing down the creek bottom looking at us. One glance told me this was definitely a shooter. Now all I had to do was coax him away from the doe he was following and get him to come about 100 yards closer. He was too close to rattle or even move my hands much, so every time he'd look away I'd blow into my little tube grunter, and he would turn and stare. And then finally, almost to my amazement, he actually left the trail she was on and started working his way down around to come downwind of us. He had closed the distance to just over 50 yards, and he was standing there up against an old fence looking. I knew he was trying to find the buck he heard, or maybe the doe that he heard that buck grunting at. I'd already played most of my cards. The only thing I could do was when he'd turn his head, I'd grunt a little and he'd whip his head back and stare some more. This is a tough game to play. This old buck's been around. He's nervous. He slowly stalked back down the fence line, and I'd grunt at him again. This is indeed a nerve-wracking and difficult game. The problem is, sooner or later you've played all your cards, and then all you can do is sit and wait for the end of the deal and then see who wins. And this time, well, this time the big buck walked away. I tried a different grunt call, and he'd stop and look back. And then he turned around and he came back. In my mind, I was imitating the voice of more than one buck trailing the same doe, something that happens when a doe gets really close to being ready to breed. I figured if anything drove a big mature buck crazy, it'd have to be that, and he had turned and come back down into the creek bottom. He was coming across again, a little farther out this time, but he was coming back. Nature may have won the first hand, but this game wasn't over, not by a long shot. He worked his way up through the brush, and I kept waiting for him to pop up along the fence, and he didn't. I guess this game was over.
Just when you think it's all coming together, it doesn't. And trust me, that happens a lot more often than you might think.
I started rattling again and he flew off, and just as I looked back, I noticed some movement in the brush. There was a monster buck coming. A huge, typical 10-point buck had snuck his way down the creek bottom, He was standing there less than 35 yards looking out. He needed to step out. Only when I grabbed my bow and looked back, he turned and went around the other way. He was trying to circle me. I watched as he came around the backside of the tree. I had a shot there too. I just needed him to step out now, step into that opening, and at 41 yards, I'd have my chance. The buck stood there and he looked and he looked. I held my bow. He just needed to step out past that tree. I had a nice opening. All he had to do was come out that trail. And I held it. And he looked. And he looked. And I held it. Finally, I had to let it down. My arms were burning. I didn't spook him though. He just stood there looking. I was pretty sure he was concentrating on my decoy. For whatever reason, like old bucks will do, he stood there. Those little tangled branches over his vitals were keeping me from taking a shot. I really needed him to just take 1 or 2 more steps between those trees. I saw him twitch his tail and turn his head. I drew my bow again. Only he didn't move. He just kept standing there. He could go forward and I'd have a shot. He could turn and go back and I'd have a shot. I tried a little soft grunt and tried to coax him out. But nothing. He just stood there. Friends, I considered myself a pretty tough old man, and I held that bow forever. But this buck just wouldn't move. And then finally, yeah, he just turned and walked right straight away.
Big deer, no matter where you encounter them, all have one thing in common. They're old. And they didn't get old by making a lot of mistakes. And despite what some might say, it really doesn't matter what kind of deer they are or where you might be chasing them.
Back in the water hole blind, and I looked up on the hill and I could see 3 great bucks working their way across the hill, coming down and around. It looked like they were going to come to the fence, jump, and then hopefully come to water. There were 2 good bucks in this group and 1 exceptional older deer. He was at least 24 or 5 wide, a 4x4 with eye guards. This was a smoker. Exactly the kind of buck I was hoping to hang my tag on. The good news, they'd worked their way to within 50 or 60 yards. The bad news, every time the wind rattled the side of that blind, they would stare and stare. And then finally a doe jumped the fence and she came down. I waited. The bucks milled and milled on the top of the hill. And then they turned and just walked away. For whatever reason, they just weren't coming.
Friends, old mule deer, old whitetails, even old elk, no matter how I plan and scout and meticulously set up, for whatever reason, they always seem to have some other idea.
All I needed him to do was come a little closer, and maybe, finally, I was going to get a shot. That big 6-point worked his way over the toe of the ridge to round up some cows, and then I saw antlers coming back up the same way. Only it was a different bull. Here was the huge 6x7 I'd seen out in the hayfield with Tom a couple of days ago. There were monster elk all over this mountain. A big old 6x6 walks behind a tree, and a giant 6x7 comes walking back out. It was almost like a magic trick. I watched as this Titan worked his cows. I tried calling a little bit, but it really didn't seem to have any effect. Still, I had to try something. I was sitting 120 yards from one of the biggest elk I have ever seen in the wild, and I just needed him to close that distance just a little bit. As I sat there, it seemed like it was raining elk. There were cows running all over the place. The big boy was coming up, pushing them up the side of the hill. More bulls were coming, including the big 6x6 I'd seen earlier. There were 2 or 3 other great-looking bulls. This was elk nirvana, and it was right in front of me. I just needed some of them to come a little closer. The big boy and 3 other dandy bulls were crossing right to left in front of me. I decided to try a little bit of calling, something. I needed to move one of them over if I could. And it appeared like it might be working when another bull up on the mountain started squealing, and the big boy started going up to answer his challenge. As soon as the big boy went up the hill, the other bulls started spreading out, started pushing cows around. I started calling again. And it was working. Right up until it quit working.
Archery elk can be just as tough as it is exciting. But even when you think you've got a deer all figured out, when you're sure you've literally got them surrounded,
all we needed was for them to work up to the dam that formed this pond and cross, and we'd have them. Either Tom or I were going to get a shot. All they had to do was cross at the normal spot. So, of course, they didn't. They actually started working their way up the road, right up to the cabin we were staying in fact. And as I sat there glassing, I could actually see Miss T was out on the porch watching the deer, who were standing at the end of the driveway watching her. Here we are sitting out in the field, and there's a shooter buck not 25 yards from Miss T standing in the front yard. I couldn't even try to stalk down there and get close. I had a button buck feeding like 10 feet in front of me. I was helpless. And for that matter, so was Tom. All we could do was watch, because even if we had snuck down to the next crossing, as it turns out, it wouldn't have mattered. For some reason, these crazy deer decided instead of going to the next dam and cross and get up on the mountain, they actually walked right up the driveway, right at the trucks that were parked there, right in front of Miss T. Anyone who has studied geometry can tell you the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And that's what these deer were doing. They were making a straight line, the shortest distance to get up to bed. It was 70, 75 degrees out already, and all I could think of was they were just trying to beat the heat. They didn't want to go any further than they absolutely had to get up into the shade before the sun got up on them. And as we watched them cross up through the horse pasture, I thought to myself, kids, better stay in school.
I love hunting the West, and I'll tell you right up front, old mule deer, big elk, they can be truly challenging, but for my money at least, nothing compares to just how frustrating a big old Midwest whitetail can be.
I checked the yardage. It was just under 40. All I needed was for him to step out. I did notice there was a little buck trailing along behind the same way he'd come in, walking in behind him. I didn't pay much attention to it other than that, though. This buck was just 40 yards out, and if he made it around that cedar tree, that'd put him at about 37. And then that big buck turned and ran back to the food plot and chased off that little spike. I snort wheezed and he stopped and looked. Yeah, this was definitely a shooter. And he was definitely gone. Other deer mess up so many hunts. He was working his way right straight in toward the doe. I thought, you know, if she stays put and he keeps coming. He'd closed the distance to about 50 yards when she turned and started back out into the field. He, of course, started angling out that way too, so I grunted at him once, and he turned and was coming. That is until the doe ran off in the other direction, and then he did a pretty quick about face and came back up the field. The only thing he didn't do was come anywhere near me.
Older deer, especially older does, they have blown up more hunts for me than anything else. But believe me when I tell you, it's not just deer that seem to be in on the submarine Kyle subterfuge, no.
I was going to do a little grunting and rattling, see could we pull something in. I'd just really gotten started when I looked over and there he was. A huge old buck was staring back at us through the brush. I just froze. I did notice out of the corner of my eye Tom was having a little trouble getting through the brush, seeing through the camera, and when he moved it just a little too far, well, that's all it took.
Friends, those older whitetails have given me the slip so many times I'm absolutely convinced they don't need any help. But I'm also convinced that sometimes, well, it feels like there's a conspiracy going on out there in the woods and everybody's in on the plan except me.
Just when I was certain it was too warm for any adult deer to be up, a dandy buck, one of the best we'd seen, started working his way through the brush. I grunted at him and he turned. He was actually working his way in. That is until I heard something behind us. A little buck had worked his way down and was standing over there by a scrape, and that was making that big boy really uncomfortable. He started back down the hill toward his doe, and that was all it took. That little guy ducked under the fence and walked right up underneath us. He was right beneath our stand. We didn't hardly dare move. All I could do was watch that big boy work his way off. And then another buck came down across the top of the hill. I just sat there thinking to myself, it just happened again. We had bucks everywhere, and we still didn't get a shot at nothing.
It's absolutely true. Regardless of what some TV deer guru might be trying to sell you, most of the time, a hunt for a big old deer ends up with little more than tag sandwiches at the end.
And he turned and started coming again. With every step, he was getting closer and closer. Now at less than 25 yards, he was well within the wheelhouse. I had all the time in the world to study him, maybe too much time in fact. He was a nice, even 10-point. A 3-year-old buck, certainly mature. All I needed now was for him to get sideways. And there we stood, face on, afraid to even breathe. At this distance, any little thing would blow this buck out of there. He wasn't real nervous, but he was pretty cautious, and I knew the longer he was this close to us, the more likely it would be that something, anything, would grenade this. He was definitely interested in the smells coming out of my face scrape, but he still hadn't turned. And then 22 yards, finally broadside. All I needed was just a couple of steps. And then he was there. I drew my bow, and then I let it back down. I decided to pass.
Yes, even my own decisions have cost me to go home empty-handed. But friends, please don't let not tagging out, don't let missing an opportunity convince you to quit. I look at every encounter with a big old buck or a bull as a true blessing, and every missed opportunity is fuel for the fire that drives me to work that much harder the next time. So remember, if and when it does happen to you, don't cry too long. Certainly don't give up, don't quit. You've already got the puzzle almost all figured out. You got close, just keep at it, you're gonna get there. And above all, friends, do not believe everything you see and hear on television. Hey, I hope you're still out there trying. There's some late season stuff going on, and if you're out there, who knows, we might just bump into you, because I'm still trying to get my tags filled. And if I do see you, friends, well, you know we're going to stop and share a deer story, a cup and a fire. And if I don't see you out there, maybe I'll see you up at the expo in Cadillac, Michigan this January. Bring your family, the dog, your pictures and stories. We'd love the chance to chat with you. If I don't see you up there, well, then I'll just wait for you right back here so we can share another adventure from my Wilderness Journal.